Hi listeners, thanks again for joining for another episode in my Ellevate series with your host, me, Becky. In this podcast, we talk about all things women empowerment, challenges in the recruitment industry, career progression, and anything else that is empowering women in business. Thanks for listening, and please remember to follow and subscribe for all updates.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am joined today with Bernadette. We are going to be discussing the role of a portfolio career and how that's kind of played a big impact in her career progression, and I suppose what it is, and go into a bit more detail on that. So just to give a quick introduction, Bernadette is originally from the south of Germany. She now lives in Berlin. She started her career in the FMCG sales and marketing space before moving into business management consulting, working in a variety of different industries from healthcare, public sector, retail, and more in the FMCG space as well. She has worked with major global brands on an international scale and now finds herself in the startup scene in Berlin, currently working for an international SaaS business. Bernadette studied business administration and has a master's in international management, having studied in Mannheim as well as Milan. So, Bernadette, thank you so much for joining me today. Really looking forward to this conversation and diving into it. So, what is the role of a chief of staff that you currently have? And let's hear from you on what it is.
Hey, Becky. First of all, thanks for having me. Chief of Staff, exciting role. And I think before going into what that role actually entails, it's really, really important to start with the origin of it. So this role actually comes from the sphere of the military and politics. Yeah, so many of you might have heard about the Chief of Staff of the White House and such. And originally in the military context, it refers to a ranking officer serving as an advisor to the commander. Yeah, so very high ranking position and an advisory role. And it's interesting to take a step back there because history is full of different advisors who played a very influential role actually and supported big leaders, and they've always been a bit in the background equally. Yeah, so many of you might have heard of Cicero. There was actually a slave in his household, Tiro, who was supporting him on a lot of coordinative tasks. He later then became freed and one of his closest friends as well. But he might have acted as a kind of, similar to a chief of staff nowadays in supporting him and coordinating things in his life. Napoleon was also said to have a close contact acting in a kind of chief of staff role. And if you remember the good old Disney movies, there was also Rafiki, the monkey in The Lion King, actually, who took on a similar role of a wise advisor to the king and helping to coordinate matters. Yeah, so it's a very old role, which now is being transported into the business sphere. What's interesting is that in Germany, we also have a similar role, actually, that has quite a lot of heritage and bigger corporations. It's called the role of the Vorstandsassistent or Assistentin. Yeah, so it's also someone very close to the CEO and the leadership team, quite experienced. So not only an assistant actually, but with higher coordinative tasks. And what we see now is that this role is very much en vogue in startups, but I've also seen that it's now on the rise with very established players. Yeah, and so consulting firms are now looking for a chief of staff. Banks are looking for a chief of staff. So it's very, very trendy right now to have a chief of staff. What's exciting is that this role can be lived in very many different ways. Yeah, and it's kind of on a spectrum. So it can start from, being a glorified assistant, lots of admin. Yeah, so very much focused on the administrative tasks. And then it can go up to being a very highly experienced executive, actually. So almost taking on a C-level role, actually, and having a lot of impact on a company. Yeah. So what is the common denominator there is actually that the chief of staff allows the C-level executives that he or she is working for, it's often the CEO, to have higher leverage on the organization. And that's a lot about prior setting, time saving, improving communication in the company, and then also managing different projects.
Great. Yeah, fantastic. It's good to hear the history side of it. And I think you're right. Some really well-known examples of where this role has always been present, but we don't necessarily always think of it from a business perspective. What would you say are the elements of the role, Bernadette?
I think it depends a lot on the focus of the position, right? On the spectrum that we just talked about. And I think it's mainly about what kind of pains is the chief of staff supposed to heal actually in an organization, which varies a lot, right? Depending on the context of this organization and the size. I've talked to a lot of chief of staff because I'm also in a network where I have a very rich exchange, and I see 5 common elements in that role that usually vary depending on what weight they take in an organization, but they're usually present. So the first one is acting as the right hand of the CEO, so representing him or her in different contexts. The second one is protecting organizational excellence. The third, acting as an integrator and communicator. So this is often more with an internal focus in the organization. Number 4 is being the confidant of the CEO or the C-level executive that the chief of staff is working for. So having a very strong relationship and being very honest in that kind of relationship as well, and having trust. And the last one, the 5th one, is actually creating focus in the organization. So prioritizing, saying no to things. And what's interesting there is that you have a play between an internal relationship with that C-level executive the chief of staff is working for, and the external relationship, meaning that you have to have a very trusting, honest internal relationship with that person, and also challenge the CEO or C-level executive on a lot of things, while externally, so when then, talking about strategy, talking about decisions that we're taking in the leadership team to other employees, or even going outside of the company and talking to other stakeholders, you actually have to be fully aligned with the C-level executive. So no deviation, you're kind of the right hand, you're representing him or her, which also creates a kind of tension that a lot of my peers are also talking about a lot.
Interesting. And I guess if any of that ever breaks down, then it completely dismantles that trust, right? And
absolutely,
it completely makes sense that they need, the chief of staff needs to be in tune with the CEO. I like your point around which pain there is to heal, but I suppose, have you ever found that in your role, part of your job is to identify where the challenges are and what pains we need to heal?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an integral part. When I did my onboarding, for example, one of the major tasks I had was talking to different stakeholders in and around the organization and coming up with a list actually of potential projects and potential pains I could heal actually. So I think that's very, very important, but it's not about healing all of those pains. I think the biggest challenge is actually prioritizing the pains and also risking that some of the pains will not be healed by you, most likely, and supporting the C-level executive you're working for in also being brave enough to not heal some of them.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And how would you say that this role has sort of evolved? Obviously, we've talked about the history of it and what it is now. And I suppose, why is it emerging in companies these days, do you think?
That's a very interesting question. So I've reflected a little bit on that, and I think there are 3 main reasons why it's emerging and so much en vogue right now. I think the first one is really this symptom of overload. We experience it in our personal lives, constantly connected to our smartphones, that we feel like, okay, there's too much going on, and we need to draw boundaries. And I feel that organizations are experiencing that in a very similar way. And it reminded me of something I encountered in my business studies, a beautiful quotation by strategist Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, who said, "The essence of strategy is choosing what not to do." That's very powerful, right? And I think a lot of organizations are struggling right now in terms of having so many potential ideas of where to go, what to do. Now there's AI emerging, everything is digital, everything is in reach, yeah? And you have to be brave enough to say no to something. And I've seen that a lot of executives are struggling actually and need a sparings partner on that with this strong internal relationship. And this act of saying no to something should not become political as such. Yeah. So that's where the chief of staff comes in as someone who's a trusted advisor, where saying no to something does not immediately become political, but you can have this honest conversation about what to say no to. So I think that's the first one. The second one is control. And I've seen that element a lot in startups I've worked for. You often have a founder who would like to have a chief of staff who wants to replicate himself or herself through that chief of staff. And the underlying hypothesis is there, and that's debatable, that the founder is still the key figure in the business, and they feel that they need someone to actually represent them, be it in another subsidiary, be it abroad, be it with clients, and have kind of a little bit of a copy of themselves going out there to represent their interests. And then the third one is, and that's a good thing, I think there's more focus on good governance and transparency emerging in many businesses. And part of good governance is good communication with different stakeholders. And many leaders I've talked to struggle to do that because their agenda is so full that often this communication is deprioritized, which is tragic, right? Because then you're losing momentum actually on informing critical people in the business. And that's also why the chief of staff is so much in demand, because he or she is the perfect figure in a business to actually take on that responsibility.
Yeah, totally. I think the point you make about the founder and the kind of control is interesting. I think from my experience, especially working with a lot of scaling businesses, oftentimes, it starts out 2-3 people. The founder can still have a really strong foothold on the day-to-day operations of the business. But as soon as you get to that threshold of it's too big, and I guess where I've seen businesses struggle is when that essentially that 1 or 2 people do try to still hold that control, and it, we always see that it can cause problems and challenges down the road in many different ways, right? So yeah, very, very interesting point. And I think it's especially relevant when businesses are struggling, because it can be, a time to just say, we're going to dive into anything and everything. But as you say, that quote was really interesting. The essence is to choose what not to do, and kind of keeping true to what your values and, your strategy. So that's interesting. Yes, absolutely. When do you think it makes sense for a business, I suppose, in a timeline, to adopt this type of role?
I think, and this might be a bit counterintuitive, that the role is not strictly dependent on the organizational size. Yeah, obviously you should be more than 20-30 people, probably. Yeah, but I think it depends a lot on those kind of pains that a CEO or a leadership team actually want to heal. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. And I think some symptoms of a pain that could be healable through a chief of staff is, first of all, that in an organization, there's the feedback from employees and maybe also other stakeholders that there's missing transparency and missing communication. Also, the CEO might feel that his or her agenda is not allowing them for any time to think anymore, because they're so busy in meetings and aligning things with the C-level and communicating, that they have this lack of time for very critical things, which is actually thinking ahead, right? Which is the key role of a C-level executive, thinking ahead and identifying the challenges of tomorrow. So it's the second kind of element where I would say, okay, if that is the case, it definitely makes sense to have a chief of staff. Then there might also be this symptom, and we talked about that as well, this culture of saying yes to many things. And we promote that a lot, right? We want to be positive, so we want to embrace things, but this culture has a very tragic downside. And then in the end, making it impossible to deliver on all of those things you say yes to. It's basically a lack of focus that gets created there. And then if you try to be everywhere at once, you usually fail to deliver anything. So that's something that I think in a lot of startups I've been talking to is a challenge, where the chief of staff can perfectly set in actually and act as someone who creates focus and who challenges every single business meeting, every single strategic initiative that is being set up on, does it contribute to our targets? And then probably the last pain I would want to mention here is, and that's also related, that the company is setting targets and constantly not achieving them in a satisfactory way. And then also there, the chief of staff can be that person protecting operational excellence, actually, and representing the C-level team in every kind of cross-functional initiative, ensuring that those targets will be met, or raising their hand if there's a risk of not achieving them, and then taking counter action. So I think there are a lot of contexts where this chief of staff role makes a lot of sense. I also think it's important to note that there are some contexts where it does not make sense to have a chief of staff, or where the chief of staff is probably the wrong remedy for the pain you want to heal. One of them is bad leadership. Yeah. If there is a leadership issue in the organization, a chief of staff cannot heal that, because the chief of staff is just an addition to the leadership team. So if there are tensions in a leadership team, if there is an avoidance of conflict in the leadership team, if there is a lack of trust in leadership team, that topic needs to be addressed directly. And then the chief of staff cannot possibly be the remedy for that. I think it would probably even make it worse, right? Because the chief of staff then is an addition to that leadership team, and every person being added makes things more complex. And I think the second topic where I would say, okay, the CEO should not have a chief of staff is when we see that pattern actually of the chief of staff not being empowered by the CEO, actually, when the CEO in the end wants to decide everything himself or herself, and the chief of staff is just a bit of a marionette of the CEO in that kind of sense. So there's no empowerment, no level of delegation happening. And if a CEO or C-level executive reflects on that and feels like, hey, I want to actually decide everything myself at the moment, at the stage of business that we're at, then probably a chief of staff is also not well placed in that organization, because it would create a lot of redundant processes and then also distract and not create that focus that the role is supposed to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are interesting points. And yeah, definitely making me reflect a little bit as well. Obviously, in my role, I speak to quite a lot of CEOs, and oftentimes they're saying, you know, we want this role, and we go through the process and it turns out they're not ready for it, actually, or they have a bit of time to figure things out before they take someone on. So it's an interesting point that you make there. So I suppose with this role, when a company is in fact ready for it, and they have, you know, things lined up and they're ready to take on a chief of staff, I think a difficult thing for them to do is to write a job description, because what is it, right? It's a bit of everything. So I guess from your perspective, Bernadette, and a kind of discussion on your career to date, where did you start? How did you get into this position? And did you plan on that?
I definitely did not plan on that. And I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that I never really made a plan for my career. I love actually saying that, you know, this typical 5-year plan that you're asked about in job interviews, this is something I associate with communism, actually, which is probably something that's not the most successful system to have existed. And I kind of refuse actually to make those plans. In turn, I am very clear on the guardrails I've defined for my career and specific elements that I want in my career and that I don't want in my career. And what I did experience is that often I've discovered positions that are perfect for me at this certain stage of my career when I just went along and explored different options. I'm a very experimental type in my career. I don't plan things, I explore, I look around, and then based on those guardrails I've identified, I can very quickly tell if the position or the option that is given to me is something of interest that would add to my career, or if it's something that would not. Yeah. So that is how I kind of have planned my career. It's quite agile in a way. Yeah. With also reflection, iteration. I also have a coach that I work with who is obviously supporting in that. But that is how I take it. And an analogy I love to draw is, we're often asked about where do you want to be in 5 years? And it reminds me of this question that we ask little children, what do you want to become? And we ask a child at the age of 6, 7. And I mean, how is that child supposed to know if they want to really join the fire brigade or become a pilot or become a vet? And I feel that it's quite similar to us then. We're financial analysts and just starting our career, and we're now expected to tell someone that we want to become a CFO. How would we know that? I think we first need to really understand what we like and what we enjoy in a certain role and be in that role to then actually say, hey, this is amazing. I like this element and I want to further explore this element, or actually, no, this is something I don't enjoy. So that's why I promote very much exploring things, being in roles actually, and then based on the experiences you make, iterating and going further along your path.
Absolutely. I think those are very good points. And the analogy is true, right? We get asked these like life-defining questions at quite young ages. Same when you're going to study your degree at university. You pretty much have to decide then and there, 18 years old, what are you going to do? And no doubt we see people change careers through life because, well, it's difficult to, write that so early on without having experienced it. So I guess if we are trying to, as you say, invest in yourself and experience these things, how do you do that? How have you done that? How did you invest into your future self to ensure that, I guess, you had these opportunities ahead of you? Because that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, I think the best investment is, first of all, not to get comfortable with the status quo. I think that's very, very important. I think it's important to see yourself and your career as something that's constantly evolving, yeah, pretty much in line with this kind of agile principle. And for me personally, I need to have the feeling of always learning and of always growing. That's a fundamental value in my life, actually. And my investment in my career has been that I've always been brave enough to leave a job actually when I felt that I'm not longer learning, or that I'm not longer learning things that are kind of adding to where I kind of see myself, or that are not in line with my values. And that's, I think, the most fundamental thing for me, actually, besides obviously having great advice from a coach who is supporting me.
And I suppose that brings us on to the question around some of these maybe softer or non kind of qualification based skills. Why are those important? And what kind of important skills have you got in your toolbox that you think you couldn't live without now?
I think, we're all talking about AI all the time, right? And that's one of the best examples of why it's impossible to plan a career, because there are constantly evolutions in technology and in the environment, actually, that make certain qualifications redundant and demand certain new qualifications. So how could you plan ahead for the next 20 years of what qualifications will be needed in the employment market, and also what qualifications you then will also enjoy without having actually tested them, first of all? Yeah. So I think that is one important element. And therefore, I think applying this principle of agility and looking at a shorter time frame and seeing where you want to go in the next few months or years actually is the safest way of planning ahead. Yeah, we do that now in developing new products. No one is planning a product pipeline for the next 12 years in the SaaS environment, right? Because there people have understood that it makes sense to start with the customers, be agile, and develop things in iterations. And as said before, I think it makes a lot of sense to apply this very similar principle to our careers. Now, you also asked about important skills in my toolbox. I love that question. I love thinking about actually the skills I have as a toolbox. Very much resonates with me. And I think the first element in that toolbox is definitely that I'm very fast at picking up things. So when I'm confronted with new knowledge, I'm usually quite good at digesting it in a speedy way and then acting on it. The second one is that I'm very fast at adapting. Probably if that wasn't the case, I would also not adopt this agile mindset, right? Because that would be very painful. But for me, it's actually energizing to adapt to new environments and to get to know new things and to learn new things. And the third one is that I can very quickly sense if something makes sense or not. And in the past, I've sometimes not really dared to trust that gut feeling. If, 99 people say this makes sense and I'm the one who feels like this doesn't make sense. In the past, I've been shutting up on that and thinking that I'm not smart enough to get it. But I've seen then over time that actually I often was onto something there. And I think that's a third kind of superpower that I have in this toolbox of mine.
Amazing. And I think based on your kind of career to date, you've been in situations where you've probably had the opportunity to learn those skills. And once you do it once, you think, okay, I can go into the next boardroom. I've been in this situation before. I can get myself out of it. Or, we've had this kind of issue before. I figured out how to solve this problem, and I'm going to apply the same kind of, I guess, analytical problem solving skills. It's a different challenge, but I have this ethos and this method that I know how to approach it and work together to achieve that. So I think that's really interesting. So I guess as a woman, we sometimes get painted with this, not necessarily in a bad way, but maybe a stereotype around being quite caring, quite team oriented, maybe not always so direct or the most salesy person in the room, but quite, collaborative perhaps. How would you say that those skills are actually quite helpful in this type of position, this chief of staff role?
Yeah. I think actually being well-rounded, and having a 360 view on things and then adding this kind of level of emotional intelligence to that, I think that's a real superpower. We talk a lot about specialization. We talk a lot about experts, actually. And I do think that having a more generalist mindset and adopting that is actually setting you up for success further down. There's this beautiful book, it's called Range by David Epstein, which was a life changer for me. And he talks a lot about the power actually of being a generalist versus someone who is highly specialized, and even makes beautiful examples of, people from the sphere of sports, for example, that are seen as highly specialized, but when you go into their career, like Roger Federer, for example, he didn't start off as a tennis player. He started off with all kinds of different types of sports that involved a ball, but then that made him better actually in playing tennis because he had a range of skill sets and movements in his toolbox that then allowed him to excel there. And you can also apply that to the sphere of science, for example. If you're connecting different dots, you're usually more creative, and that's something that generalists are better at than people who are highly specialized. If we focus too much and if we have too much information on one thing, we're often actually failing to take a step back and seeing the bigger picture, which is very valuable. And I do think it makes sense to apply that also to our careers and to our skill sets. And I would encourage everyone who's starting a career or who's in their career right now to actually adopt this mindset of rather being well-rounded and a generalist than diving too deep into something, because it sets you up for success going forward, and it makes you very adaptable in kind of all kinds of different environments. Who knows what's coming with AI and all the political tensions coming up. If you're a generalist, then you can always reinvent yourself and be successful in the future.
Absolutely. And as you say, going back to your point around adaptation, right? You will be able to adapt to these new challenges or new technologies, if it's that, or new markets, whatever that might look like. So I think those are really interesting points. And I get the sense from you, Bernadette, that you've probably been given opportunities, and you've probably been the type of person who said yes to those and taken them on. And I think a lot of people who do well in your kind of space probably do take those risks, and as you say, kind of don't plan too much, but do the best in that role that you can, and then gain the experience from it, and each time you're kind of chipping away at that progression, right? So yeah, those are really interesting points, and thank you so much, Bernadette. I think it's been an inspirational conversation. I'm really keen to keep talking about this kind of role. I think many businesses will be kind of moving towards that and benefiting from it into the future. So it's been really good. Thank you so much. I guess the last question to leave you with is, which location is on your next vacation bucket list?
It's actually Japan.
Okay.
I've been wanting to go for a while. I was very passionate about it as a kid, watching mangas on TV. And I did a semester abroad in Singapore when I started to explore Southeast Asia, and then from there going over to China and other areas in Asia, Sri Lanka and such. So I've now, through COVID, been a bit restrained in my travel behavior because Japan would have been the next country up, and I haven't been back to Asia actually ever since. So that one is very high up on my list. I'm probably not going to make it this year yet because things are very busy, but it is one of the key destinations for the next year for me.
Amazing. And maybe if you go next spring, you can catch the cherry blossom. So
that is the plan. That is amazing. The plan indeed, Becky.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Bernadette. I've loved this conversation. Look forward to sharing it with our listeners. I think I'll also link some of the books that you mentioned as well, so that people can take a look. But yeah, I've had a really good time today. Thank you so much. Look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Becky. It was great to be here.
See you soon.